very much, Phil. So the black eye actually came from a hockey injury. It was not ransomware related, I'm happy to say. But here, if you want to see what I look like without the black eye, it's right here for you in full high definition. So my name is Kevin Perlow. I currently work at Booz Hamilton, and I'm a malware analyst. I do cyber threat intelligence along with some threat hunting, some host forensics, a nice mix of things. I went to school at Trojan University actually for business and just sort of worked my way into this industry. Thought it was a little bit more interesting. So what we have here is we're going to be talking about transactions on the blockchain, but we're not just going to be talking about Bitcoin transactions. It's going to be our primary focus. A little later on, we're going to talk about Namecoin transactions as well, because that's something you're going to start to see a little more nowadays. So the first thing is, well, what is a blockchain? A lot of times people talk about the blockchain, and when they do that, they mean the Bitcoin blockchain. But a blockchain itself, it's just a series of recorded transactions on a public ledger that's decentralized. So a way to think about this, and using Bitcoin as an example, if I wanted, so my brother's here in the audience, if I wanted to pay him $1 right now, all of you would watch me do that, and so you would all agree that it happened, we would record it to a database, and that transaction, no one could ever dispute that it took place. With a blockchain, what you do is when you have enough of these new transactions and new data, you put it on a block, and from there, you take a hash of the previous block of data and you put it in this new block and you store it, and that's how it builds on itself. That's all a blockchain is. If you're interested in the cryptography behind a blockchain, go to the RSA conference. We're not going to talk about it here. But if you want to talk about some other things that you can do aside from monetary transactions, we have medical records. You could potentially use blockchain technology for this, although I think after this presentation you'll agree that that's a horrible idea. You can do currency, which we mentioned, and you can do DNS, domain name system, where you have a decentralized domain name system, and so you have some resiliency behind your domain. So Bitcoins have become the de facto currency for really any sort of illegal activity on the internet, but it was designed to just be an anonymous or pseudo-anonymous way to conduct transactions. So Bitcoins are built around something called Bitcoin wallets and Bitcoin addresses. You can think of a Bitcoin wallet as something that holds a lot of prepaid debit cards, which would be the Bitcoin addresses. And there's something very interesting here. If you go to a store, when you purchase a good or product from that store, you might only turn over, if you have $20 on one of these prepaid debit cards, you might only turn over 15 of those dollars. But with Bitcoins, you turn over the whole 20, and then it sends part of it back to you as change. And so the way that it goes back as change, it could either be to the same address that sent it to the recipient address, or it could go to a different address. And that all just depends on how your Bitcoin wallet is configured and which Bitcoin wallet system you're using. That particular nuance is going to be important for tracking some of these things down. And so I have that captured here. Two different examples. The one on the top, let's assume you're buying a banned book for a Bitcoin. You might send 20 Bitcoins over. One would come back to the same Bitcoin address. Alternatively, you have the example on the bottom where you send 20 Bitcoins over. 19 go back to the, sorry, I misspoke in the first one. 19 go back to the first Bitcoin address. On the second one, 19 go back to the second Bitcoin address. It's a totally different address. And the theory behind this is that it makes it a little harder to tell who received versus who gave the money in a transaction. So that's what we're going to jump into here is how do we track these transactions? There are really only two resources that we're going to need. The first is blockchain.info. It has an API. It's very useful. It tracks all Bitcoin transactions, and it records the timestamps for them. It records the addresses that we're sending money, addresses receiving money. And what we can do with that is anytime you have an address from a ransom payment, you can just throw it in there and see what you find. The other tool is going to be Wallet Explorer. It does the same thing, but the purpose behind Wallet Explorer and the interface behind Wallet Explorer is instead to correlate the addresses into certain wallets, and in some cases to identify those wallets with Bitcoin exchanges or other major Bitcoin entities. So they do two different things. They work very well in tandem. The person that made Wallet Explorer actually now works for Chain Analysis, which you can think of as the premium version of this. So we're going to be using both of those tools. So we're going to start simple. We're going to use something called the Globe ransomware. This is not a major ransomware family, but it illustrates what we're doing pretty well. So I did redact the personal key, but you can imagine having one of these messages show up on your screen, and I think most of the people in this room have either handled an incident or you do malware analysis. You're familiar with these. There's also, what this message says, it says to go email frogobiggins@india.com, and if you email him and you tell him you've been infected and you give him your ID, which we redacted here, he'll go ahead and he'll give you a Bitcoin address. And you can also see that there's a price for 0.5 Bitcoins that you're going to have to pay. The first thing, if you're handling one of these incidents, just to kind of, as a bit of a side note, you want to look up that email address because you want to get a sense of, has this guy been around doing anything else? Has he used other ransomware families? And he has. Do we know any other TTPs associated with him? Because we ultimately don't want to just decrypt our files. We want to prevent this from happening again. This person we suspect is primarily associated with RDP brute force attacks, maybe even PSExec remote brute force attacks. So we get that address from him. It's at the top, right under the title here, the 1HYAS, and we throw it in blockchain.info, and this is what you get. And this isn't a full list. I snipped some out of the middle, but you can see that there were other people who paid 0.5 Bitcoins. So the good news is other people are paying this person. You're probably going to get your files back. If you were to make a payment and get the decryptor, it'll probably work. The bad news is other people are paying this guy. I believe it's 1.5 Bitcoin, sorry. Other people are paying this guy, and so you probably do also need to pay him to get your files back. There probably isn't a free decryptor out there, otherwise who would bother? The next thing you want to do is you want to post this on Wallet Explorer. So on this screen you can see that a total received, but on Wallet Explorer you get a whole list of all the transactions that this person's had. And so the output from Wallet Explorer is on the left part of the slide. You can dump it as a CSV, which shows up on the right part of the slide. And what we can do here is take inventory of what he's been receiving. So we're interested in probable ransom income. That's going to be that's going to be payments to this Bitcoin wallet where the amount was exactly the same as in the ransom note. And we come up with 24 of those. Another metric I had, because we're really just estimating here, is what about possible ransom income? The possible ransom income is the metric I came up with was anything that was 4 digits or fewer. So if someone paid 1.75, that might be a ransom payment. That's a pretty specific amount. In the cybercriminal underground, even though they use Bitcoins for these transactions, they typically peg the Bitcoin to some sort of currency value, often USD. And so what you're going to see instead for more of a business-like transaction that's not a ransomware transaction, you'll see something like 1.7829, some longer number like that. So that's where we came up with the other number. Now you might say this is a pretty wide range, it's a factor of 2. But what I find and what we'll see when we go into the Locky example coming up in a second is it's really an order of magnitude that we're concerned about. So this guy, we're talking in the tens of thousands of dollars, maybe up to $50,000 is what he's received over the many months that he's been doing this, about 6 months year to date. So that's good. I mean, this doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it illustrates the point and how to use these tools. What we're a little bit more interested in is going to be this Locky ransomware example. This is one of my favorite ones. So what's interesting here is we're going to see a sense of scale. So Locky ransomware came out in January, February 2016. It was famous for hitting a hospital, and a hospital has to stay in operation, so they had no choice but to pay the ransom. And this Locky example, what we're going to find is they're not alone. A lot of other people have paid this. So on the bottom right of the screen is going to be the Bitcoin address that you would have to pay for this particular Locky instance. But what I have to point out is that for the Locky ransomware and for a lot of other sophisticated cybercrime or cybercrime group affiliated ransomware where it's not just one actor, these are generated server side and they're generated unique to each instance of Locky. So what that means is when you first get this address, it's going to be blank. I should also say this was one provided by another security analyst. I do just want to thank them for contributing this. They didn't want me to say who they were. But we couldn't do this type of analysis without having this happen. So because it's a unique Locky Bitcoin address, in order for us to get any data out of this, someone has to pay it. And so that once someone pays it, the criminal then has to move the money because otherwise they wouldn't be able to use it, they wouldn't be able to cash it out, and it would be a totally worthless exercise for everybody involved. And that's what happens here. On the bottom left, we have our victim. On the bottom right, we have that money being paid. Then this is just the default interface for blockchain.info on the top left. the money moves again, and it moves as part of a much larger, I think, 80 Bitcoin transaction. And what that means is there were other Bitcoin addresses involved in this. So our next step here is where things start to get interesting. We want to map out the blockchain. That might seem like a daunting task, and it is. Here you go. So on the left, there's a script that's on GitHub that you can use to do this. You plug in an address, and it'll map this out in Graphs format. But we see some very interesting, just looking at this, and I know you can't read them. We'll get to that in a second. We'll zoom in. But on the left, the circles on the left, or the ovals on the left, are going to be people paying. Those are going to be the victims. In the middle, those are those intermediate addresses. And then on the right, if we go back here, there we go. On the right are going to be those two addresses that received the money. It turns out other addresses are also funneling money to these 2 points. So we're interested in those, and that's where we're going to do our exploration. But first, someone earlier had an enhanced button. So do I, and mine's better. It has a red box. So we have, this is one of the other sections on that graph, and we've identified, just by throwing this into blockchain.info, we've identified another possible ransom payment because we have 2 Bitcoins. That's around the right amount for, or 3 Bitcoins, whatever. It's around the right amount for a ransomware payment. And if you go and you look at the other ones, you'll find the same thing over and over and over again. So we do want to dive into where this money is going. So we throw it in Wallet Explorer, and what do we have? Well, we have that one of these receiving addresses is part of a much larger list, and it's received 81 pages on Wallet Explorer worth of transactions. This is a lot. In fact, this is a very, 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 very large number for a non-Bitcoin exchange. You can also see, it's a little hard to read the numbers on there, but you can see a lot of single-digit numbers. Those are going to be 3, 4, 2, 5. Those are about the right amount for a ransomware payment. And so if you go through all 80 pages of this, that's what you find over and over again, is that these guys, since January 2016, conveniently when Locky came out, all the way through October 2016, and then they took a bit of a break, and then in January 2017, we're receiving these ransom payments. So our next question here is, well, what does this all mean? And what can we do with this data? The first thing we want to do is come up with some estimate of how much money they've made. There's a couple different ways. There's a conservative one, so only transactions by 0.25, the one from before, the 4 characters in length, and then one where we just add them all up, and we can do that. They've never even received any increment over 10 Bitcoins, so it's entirely possible everything here was a ransom payment. And so you can see the numbers there. I tend to think we're talking somewhere between 13,000 and 14,000 Bitcoins on this. I'm sure other people have paid them for other things, but the point stands, even back in 2016 Bitcoin currency value, we were looking at over $10 million from January through October. That's crazy. And when you do the victim count, you're looking at 6,000, 8,000 victims that have paid. That's not even the people that were just infected with it and couldn't figure out how to pay or just said, I'm not going to pay. That number, they have targets on the cybercriminal undergrounds for these things, but that number could easily be 5% of the total infections. It could be even less than that. That part we just don't know. The point is, this is such a huge scale. So how does this help as an incident responder? Well, the main thing for an incident responder is to figure out, or one of the main things, who targeted us, or was this even a targeted attack? Probably not if you're getting hit by something like this, where there were 81 other pages of ransom transactions. I mean, maybe they targeted your industry, maybe not. But when we think back to the Globe example, where we thought, okay, that was more of an RDP brute force attack, you want to do a complete investigation, but the priority you're going to take into certain actions after this are going to be different. You're not going to be necessarily worried about closing down an open RDP port that shouldn't be there. Instead, you're going to be worried about, well, we probably have to fix our email filtering and upgrade some detection logic and stop this from happening. But there are 2 different approaches. The main point being, at least you're not concerned that you were targeted. Everyone was targeted. You're just concerned that you were infected. The last point I want to take here is the cash outs. So here you can see them actually moving 220, 100, 150 Bitcoins to an exchange called BTC. They did use a couple other exchanges. You can see some other cash outs here that weren't identified by Wallet Explorer, but that's just what these guys tend to do. They tend to put about 50 to 100 to 200 Bitcoins at a time, and they cash it out. And because there's no way to subpoena BTCE unless their database ever gets leaked or unless law enforcement finds a way to compel them to turn over that data, out the money goes, and we don't know who's getting it. If they ever do get that data, then we'll be able to find out. So the third thing we want to talk about is attribution. There's sort of a myth behind Bitcoins that you can never do any sort of attribution. This is not a totally unique example. It's a little rarer, but I did want to show it because it's interesting. There is a way to do some deductive reasoning and come up with an attribution, at least in this particular instance. So this is the Shark and Atom ransomware. It kind of hit the news in, I want to say around October 2016, actually, around the same time frame as when that Locky activity was happening, when we've started focusing in on that. The idea behind the Shark ransomware was, hey, we'll give you a portal, or we'll give you a tool, and you can use that tool to build your own ransomware. You put in your Bitcoin address. We're just going to take 20% of the cut. It was first advertised on a Russian website, so were these people Russian? It'd be a reasonable guess, but we would like a second data point on that. And so here on the bottom, you can see the panel. You can see the ransom note. But more interestingly, you can watch on the blockchain, or you could watch at the time when this was in service, the money go to a payment address that was specified by the attacker. And then at the top, you can see an 80-20 split happen for when it was making the payment on the blockchain, the 20% going to the authors, the 80% going to the attacker. As far as network forensics go, it's kind of exciting to watch this happen on the blockchain and then watch it happen in a PCAP as it's coming back to the infected host. It's kind of cool. But what's even more cool is they used that same address they didn't generate a new 20% address. They used the same one for a host of other transactions, and at one point they might have even paid themselves through a chain of events, possibly testing their own infrastructure. It's not entirely clear if they were running a test or if they were just paying a different address of theirs or different wallet of theirs. But you can see the graph here. It looks similar to the other graphs. And in red is going to be this one FCW address, which is where they're receiving these 20%. And that's going to be the main pivot point for what we're going to do next. So we throw it in Wallet Explorer. We've got one other address there. Starts with 16Q3. And the other way to correlate these two is if we look at the transactions on there, we can also say, well, one FCW had an address, put money, and I'm going to graph these, so if it's just rattling off numbers, don't panic, there's a graph coming. But the one FCW, the first address to fund this part of the ransomware Bitcoin infrastructure, starts with 16QCM, and the first one to ever fund that starts with 16Q3, and that was also paid by one FCW. So the deductive logic there creates this loop, and so you would at least be able to determine that if you didn't know from Wallet Explorer, you could do some deductive reasoning and say, well, these are owned by the same person. Given the time frame of these transactions, given what was happening, you could say that pretty comfortably. What we're going to do then is we're going to use this graph, and we're going to pivot off of this graph. I'm going to add to it a little bit. So what's the first to fund 16Q3? Well, this address starting with 17N4MI. That's therefore likely also owned by the Atom author. And when we talk about mapping these out, we're curious, well, where else did that one send money? So in the same transaction that it funded this, it also sent money to another Bitcoin address. And when we talk about change from earlier on, that's what we meant. And this is an example where it becomes particularly relevant. So here's our new graph. We've added a little section at the bottom. We still have that triangle relationship from the ones we found before. So let's keep going. So we've branched off in one spot. We're funding part of our ransomware infrastructure. What are we doing in the other spot? Well, we can follow these a little bit more. It sends money to another address. That address sends money to two more addresses. Those last two addresses are tagged on Wallet Explorer as something called matvia.com. And I'll show you that momentarily. But here's the graph. We can see our overlap from the infrastructure, what funded the infrastructure, what did the simultaneous paying, and where the money all goes on the bottom right. So I mentioned matvia.com. If you map this all out using the script from before, it'll look something like this. It just depends on which address you use as the baseline for the script. But we have a couple others at the bottom right that are also matvia.com. Well, here's matvia.com. You can see the Cyrillic text there. So we're looking at a Russian Bitcoin exchange. So here's our second data point that I mentioned earlier that we were trying to get to. Originally, we were talking hey, these guys posted on a Russian language forum. A lot of people do that, and a lot of people do it in really awful Russian. But these guys might actually be Russian, and we have that nice little extra data point. And so this was a cool piece of attribution. Now, it's important to point out, of course, it could be a false flag. But given that this was pretty unsophisticated and given the other things we know about ransomware and about these guys in general, we're pretty comfortable with this assessment and with this data point. So I do have a bonus example on here. I don't have time to go through it today, and I wasn't planning on going through it today, but if you want to ever look at something with the Spora ransomware, it's on Cyber4Sight's blog, which is the group I work at Booz Allen. And you can go through this and see how Spora is an affiliate program and how you can come up with that deduction just based off of blockchain analysis. And that's not a grand proclamation at this point, but when this was new and when this was 3 days old, it was pretty interesting data to see the first Spora affiliates get paid. And so that's something you can look at when the slides are posted online later. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is the Namecoin blockchain. The Namecoin blockchain is pretty interesting. It's another use of blockchain technology, and the idea behind it is to decentralize domain name systems. Allegedly for the purposes of anti-censorship, but you can use it for your malware because no one can take down your domain if it's sitting on a blockchain. Instead, they have to take down the actual, or they have to retake the actual IP address that your domain would resolve to. So a little bit more about this. Namecoin domains are going to be .bit domains. They're not an official ICANN domain, top-level domain. So what you have to do is you have to do a DNS query to an open NIC server, or you have to do a DNS query to a dedicated Namecoin DNS server. That's two interesting things to look at in your network logs. I've seen some misconfigurations do those before, but I've also seen just straight-up malware do it before. There's really no good reason this should ever happen. Now, this blockchain can work as a regular cryptocurrency blockchain. The currency isn't worth a whole lot right now, but the other part of this is the domain names sit on special coins on this blockchain so that you can't accidentally buy bread with whatever website .bit. Like, that would be weird, and so they don't want that to happen by accident. And that special coin has a special property in how these things get updated, that it tends to flatten out the blockchain for analysis. The consequence of that, and I'll show what I mean by that visually, but the consequence of that is it's really easy to track and map out Namecoin infrastructure. So that's what we're going to do. With this example of the Shifu banking Trojan, on January 6, 2017, Palo Alto's Unit 42 came out with a really, really good reverse engineering report on this. And part of it was they noted that, hey, this banking Trojan started using these two .bit domains at some point in 2016. The picture up here is actually a newer version of it, an updated version of this information, because at the time, there were only a couple IPs associated with each of these two domains on there. And the question I had was, well, what other infrastructure, there's no way these actors were only using two domains and a couple of IP addresses. And a few other things happened too. A couple days after that report came out, I have in a little box here, you can see that they zeroed out the IP address. So by looking at the Namecoin system, you already know, hey, these guys are reading open source intelligence reports just like we all are, and they zeroed out their infrastructure. And we're going to see that happen in a couple other pieces of this as well. So what we want to do, there's no API for this, so you're going to be on your own for the scripts we go for later, but what you want to do is you want to take the first transaction from one of these domains because that's when it was created. So here's the first transaction. There's a lot on the screen, and I know that. I'm going to talk through all of it. But the first transaction on the Namechain website will show that, it'll show when this was first created. So you can see the operation is op name new. That means a new domain being made. You can see a change address happening. So a certain amount of Namecoin currency was used to perform this operation, but then another amount went to change. Like 23 or 24 Namecoin change was later used to register the second domain that was listed in the Palo Alto report. So we already know those two were associated just with a couple of clicks. Now, the next thing here is that we want to kind of go backwards a little bit more. So this Namecoin address was generated somewhere. So when we go to the first transaction involving it, like so, we'll see that it actually was part of change from another Namecoin operation from another domain called healthshop.bit. And this had a different IP address. But what we can do is we can look at the overlapping IP addresses for this infrastructure now. We can look at just all of the data from the healthshop domain, all of the data from the one we were looking at, the Slava Ukraine domain, and we can say, hey, there was a shared relationship on the blockchain, but there was also a shared infrastructure relationship. These things were resolving to the same IP addresses at different points in time. And so that's what we have right here. If you compare them side by side, you'll see in the blue, you'll see some of the same IP addresses. You'll see that they were zeroed out on the 11th at the same time. So those are some pretty good data points. We would say with almost near certainty that the same people were operating these domains. So good, we found an extra domain. That's good for our incident responders. That's good for our SOC. We also know when these IP addresses were relevant because when they switch the IPs, they're no longer true indicators of compromise. I mean, they might still own the infrastructure, but they might not. So what we want to do next is, what else can we find? And in going the same way that we went with mapping out the Bitcoin infrastructure, we can do the same thing here. We can go to each transaction that happens, look at the addresses, go to each transaction of those, and so on and so forth. And so what we do is we get a graph here, and I tried to zoom in as best I can, but it illustrates a point I'm about to make. This is a much flatter blockchain. And you can even see that I included the scroll bar in the picture so you can see how wide this goes. But in doing this, you get a nice little visualization. You can see that these addresses, that these domains, that these IP addresses are truly related. It's just not enough to have a graph, though. You would never be able to constantly be scrolling left and right. So the other thing you want to do is if you go to do something like this, you want to dump a nice little CSV file, which, or actually two CSV files, one with just the infrastructure and one with the dates that this happens. And I did my best to show the relationship here. So you'll see that they have similar IP space in some cases. You'll see shared IP addresses. The next thing you would want to do is either in Graphiz or in Analyst Notebook. You want to take all these data points and you want to correlate them together and show that they are truly all linked. Before I go to that picture on the right, you can also see some interesting TTPs from these actors. You can see that they tend to name their domains in some similar ways. So you've got like Forever Young and Forever One. You have a couple that have the term data in them. A few others like that, a couple with references to Russia or Ukraine. So it's some other interesting TTPs, and that gives you even more confidence that these are related. And when you map it all out, here's what you wind up with. And so remember, we started with only 2 domains, and when we ended this, we wound up with over a dozen domains that these guys were using as part of this campaign. We also, just to go back real quick, it's a little cut off at the top, but you can see that they've been doing this since March of 2016. So we have a nice firm start point for this activity as well. And that gives you some really good actionable intelligence that you can use for this. And it's just a nice little example of, while the Namecoin blockchain is a little bit esoteric, and while it provides some sort of resiliency for these actors, we can actually use it against them. And so that's kind of where we are for doing some of this blockchain analysis. So just a quick recap. The blockchain stores an awful lot of data, and if you're good with just some basic deductive logic and maybe a little bit of scripting, you can find out a whole host of historical information just by navigating through it properly. I do have 2 items in here in question marks. They're things we should think about. Given what I just showed you where we can map out Namecoin domains, do we really want to be in a situation where someone's medical records are stored on a blockchain? And that's one of the common ones that's listed for blockchain technology. My argument personally would be, well, probably not, because as soon as, if there's an OPSEC failure of some form or a database gets leaked and someone's personal medical blockchain address were to be paired with their name, you would have all of their history. And so I think that's something we have to think about. With property titles, it'd be a similar situation. On the other hand, it does provide resiliency, and it does provide nice data storage, and it could be used to prevent fraud. So we do have to consider both sides of that.